My name is Dr. Michael Greening, and what I have for you today is a short presentation on Thomas Hardy's poem Neutral Tones. What I'm going to do is to pose a series of questions about this poem. After each question, you may, if you wish, pause the recording, have a think, jot down some ideas, discuss them with those around you. I'll follow up the question with my own thoughts and suggestions and speculations, and the whole purpose of the presentation is to get you thinking about and analysing this poem in real detail. So let's begin at the beginning with the title, Neutral Tones. Now, Thomas Hardy could have called this poem anything. He could have called it The Day at the Pond. He could have called it The Breakup, but he decided to call it Neutral Tones. So why do you think he went for that title? What do you see as its significance? And as I say, you may like to pause the recording at this point to give yourself a chance to think or write or discuss. So for me, Neutral Tones is a title that can refer to both colour and voice. It can refer to the drab, colourless landscape in which the events of the poem are set, and it can refer to the flat, seemingly unemotional tone of voice in which the poem is delivered. It is worth thinking about whether you regard this as an emotionally neutral poem, because some people, when they go through painful experiences, they can, in a way, they can shut down, they can become kind of numb. Is that the case with this poem? Is it a kind of flat, numb, neutral, unemotional poem, or does it contain strong emotions? And if so, where would you see the evidence? It's also worth reminding ourselves that the word neutral can also mean impartial. So if you are neutral, you don't take sides. So would this be true of this poem? Is this an impartial poem, or does the speaker take sides? Because it is a poem about a breakup, and of all the experiences in life where people can't resist taking sides, breakups would be pretty high on that list, because when couples break up, there can be bitterness, there can be recriminations, and people want to apportion blame. So would you say that is true of this poem? Does the poem convey bitterness? Does it take sides? Is it one-sided? Or is the speaker neutral and impartial? The second question I'd like you to ask you about neutral tones is, what story does the poem tell? I want you to imagine you're a journalist, for example. You're a journalist, and what you'd like to do is to convert this poem into an article for your newspaper, an article maybe for the gossip column, because it is, after all, about someone's private life. It's about a breakup. So what could be more juicy for a gossip column and for a gossip columnist than the story of a breakup? So if you had to convert this poem into that story for your newspaper gossip column, what do you think it would look like? Okay, so as you will soon have realised, the reason why I asked this question is really to highlight the extraordinary lack of detail in this poem. There are no names in the poem. There are no identities, nothing to tell you who people are. There are no dates. You don't really know when things are happening. There are no place names. You don't know where things are happening. All the references to time seem deliberately vague. So that winter day, it doesn't really narrow things down, does it? That winter day, which winter day, which year? We don't know. Riddles of years ago, and then since then, time has elapsed since the breakup, but we don't know quite how much time. So if you were a journalist and you wrote up a story of a breakup in which there were no names, no identities, no dates, no references to locations, and what you said is there are these two people, we don't know their names, they split up by a pond, you would get laughed at the editor's office. You wouldn't get that published. This is what's so interesting about poems, about the language of poetry, is that what would fail catastrophically as a newspaper article, because the lack of detail and specificity, succeeds as poetry. So we need to think a bit about why that might be the case. So why does the poem withhold so much? Why does it withhold all the juicy details? Some possible answers to that question that I'm just offering for your consideration. You could say that this is a reticent poem spoken by a reticent person. So if you are reticent, you are you're self-contained, you are unforthcoming, you don't like to be the centre of attention, and maybe those are the qualities of the poem. You could argue that the lack of specificity makes the poem more universal. So Hardy had given us loads of details. He'd said that this happened in December 1864 near Winchester, and he split up from Sheila, and the reason they split up was X and Y and Z. The more specificity you get, the more the experience that the poem deals with might seem to be just the uniquely relevant to Hardy and his former lover. But actually, by keeping it open, by not narrowing things down, it could be that the poem seems all the more open and universal in the way it deals with experiences such as love and loss and disappointment. Finally, you could argue that the poem withholds information because the gaps in the poem spark the reader's interest. So, for example, why did they split up? We don't really know. We don't really know precisely what went wrong in their relationship. And sometimes in a story or in a poem, when the author holds something back, that's what stirs your imagination into life, because you feel the need to begin to fill the gaps. So it is, I think, that the poem withholds stuff so that it comes to life in the reader's imagination. Okay, my next question is about language. I want you to think about how language contributes to the poem's meaning and impact. As a tip, I think whenever you think about language in poetry, it's always advisable as soon as possible to go to specific examples. So I would, as a kind of question within the question, I'd invite you to maybe think, is there a key phrase or a key line in the poem that you would say, I think, this for me is the key to the poem, or this is the most memorable or the most distinctive or the most striking line or phrase in the poem. So if you could do that, if you could pick out a phrase, pick out a line that you think has real impact, and then ponder it, think, what is it about the way Hardy is using words? What is it about the way that Hardy is using language here in my quotation that is having such an impact? If I was thinking about the language of the poem, and if I was beginning to analyse it, one thing that I would say is that the language is at times very stark, plain, and uncomplicated. So you have pond, sun, tree, leaves. Some of the central images of the poem are monosyllabic words, so words of one syllable. And I think that partly this is to do with the winter landscape that Hardy is representing. Everything is blank, everything is dead, everything is pared down to the minimum. Some of the language of the poem is archaic. So if something is archaic, it's old-fashioned, it seems to belong to an earlier phase of human history. So the bird our wing, or the sun is chidden and cursed. This kind of language, it would have been archaic even when Hardy was writing. It seems to me that one reason why he occasionally uses this old-fashioned language is to give the sense that the experiences that he is reporting, they're not new, they're not things that have happened for the first time in 1867. They are timeless, that previous decades, previous generations will have gone through very, very comparable experiences. So the use of old-fashioned language is just a way of creating a thread of connection from the present to the past, and that thread of continuity happening both at the level of words but also at the level of emotion. I've said that the language can seem very uncomplicated, pond, sun, tree, leaves, but that changes. And for me, it changes once the poem begins to focus on the former lover, where you get complex figurative language. So figurative language is language that uses figures of speech, such as, could be metaphor, it could be simile, and it is often about creating quite intricate comparisons between different things. So, for example, in stanza 3, how is the former lover's smile described? a grin of bitterness like an ominous bird a wing. So suddenly you've got this slightly more ambitious poetic language that suddenly things are getting a bit more intricate. Let's think also about in stanza 2 when Hardy says, "Your eyes on me were as eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago." So if someone came up to you and said to you, "Do you know what your eyes are like?" Your eyes are like eyes that rove over tedious riddles of years ago. That's what your eyes are like. It's a very, very elaborate way of describing someone's eyes. Can you visualize that? Can you visualize what Hardy is trying to say or trying to describe with that comparison? I think it's actually quite hard to do. So you've gone from language which I think has this kind of very stark vividness, the pond, the sun, the trees, the leaves, to language which is much more intricate and subtle. And I think what's going on here is that Hardy can describe nature in very plain and direct ways. When he's describing his former lover, he's describing emotions that are really painful and difficult and complex. So it's almost as though the complexity of the language ramps up to try and do justice to the complexity of the emotion. I invite you to think about whether there might be a line or a phrase that for you really sums up the poem or is the most striking moment in the poem. A line or phrase that I might choose if I were sort of thinking about that question is from the final stanza, and it's 3 words. The phrase "rings with wrong." Love rings with wrong. What makes this phrase pop out for me? Various things. It's that alliteration. It's the half rhyme. So ring and wrong. They don't quite rhyme perfectly, ring and wrong, but they almost do. So that's what's known as a half rhyme. So the language here is very intense. It is alliterative. It's almost rhyming, and it's using this imagery of ringing. When you wring something, when you wring out a towel or when you wring out a cloth, it's about twisting something to dry it, to get the water out of it. So that physical experience of twisting suggests that Hardy feels like he's been put through the wringer. He's been wrung out by the painfulness of love and disappointment. So just with 3 words, he's conveying, with what strikes me, a real sense of physical intensity, all the unspoken emotions in the poem. And when you think about what ringing does, is it squeezes water out of a cloth or a towel or fabric. And that strikes me potentially as a reference to tears, potentially as a reference to one of the most ultimate ways in which people deal with and process and express strong emotions. So this is what's so fascinating for me about the texture of the language in this poem, is at times it seems flat, it seems almost as though he's just numb when he thinks about the past. But then that image of love that rings with wrong conveys a real sense of emotional intensity and suffering. My final question is, how does the poem's structure contribute to its meaning and contribute to its impact? Think about the way the poem tells the story. The first word of the poem is the word we. So we establishes a couple. There are 2 people, but they're a unit, they're an item. They have a shared identity. It's we. But that shared identity pretty soon begins to disintegrate as the poem develops. So pretty much it's not we, but me and you. And actually, while we're on the subject of pronouns in the poem, it's a very personal poem, but it never uses the word I. We get the word me, don't we, in the final stanza. Lessons have shaped me, but it never uses the word I. And I think there's an interesting balance in that, in the structure of the poem, where it feels to me at the same time both a deeply personal poem and a deeply impersonal poem. That in some ways it's telling us a personal story about Thomas Hardy's love life, but also it almost takes refuge in impersonality, that it doesn't give us too much detail. It doesn't show or reveal too much. The structure of the poem, it's structured like a folk ballad, and it has this A-B-B-A rhyme scheme throughout it. So a couple of points I'd want to make. The one is a folk ballad is a tradition of sort of poetry which is handed down just by ordinary people via word of mouth through the generations. So in writing the poem in the form of a ballad, once again, I think what Hardy's trying to do is to articulate personal experience, but more on a shared or general or even universal level, almost as though this is timeless. It doesn't matter if it happened in 1862 or 1864, because it happens to couples all the time. So that the folk ballad structure is a way of accessing and conveying that sense of timelessness, but also that sense of circularity as well. So if you look at how the stanzas begin and end, day and grey, rove and love, thing and wing, deceives and leaves. So that rhyme of the first line with the last line conveys a sense of circularity. And in fact, the whole poem circles back on itself. So think about the imagery at the start. We have the pond, we have the tree, we have the leaves, we have the sun. And at the end, once again, we get the sun, the tree, the pond, and the leaves. People talk about, I don't know, a criminal going back to the scene of the crime. This is a poem with a similar kind of structure to it, where the poet can't help but just revisit not the scene of the crime, but the scene of the breakup, the scene of the really sort of painful emotional experience. And what that circularity creates in the structure of the poem is it creates a sense of someone who hasn't moved on, someone who is reliving this experience. So even though time has passed, you know, it could be months, it could be years, part of them is still there, part of them is still there at the edge of the pond, still processing, still trying to come to terms with the impact of this breakup. Okay, so I hope those questions sort of led you in interesting directions, and I hope my thoughts and speculations and theories about the poem shed some light on it and helped you enjoy what I think is a fascinating piece of writing. So I'm going to leave you with a slide, which is simply an invitation to get in touch with us, should you wish to. We at Lancashire University are always delighted to hear from potential applicants, from people interested in studying English literature or creative writing at university level. My contact details are there for you. So thanks very much for listening.